is revealed in what we do. And yet, the conundrum reveals the essence of why we rest from work and worship God on this day. It goes back to the same truth we saw at the beginning of this study. The first commandment, you and I were created to worship, and we will worship something. If we don't worship God, we will nevertheless worship something. And this is an either-or scenario. If we're not resting and worshiping God on this day, you can be sure you are worshiping something else. It is not an option. You will worship God or something else. And so you see what a great test of faith this is. You know, particularly during the harvest, where it's costing you money, moment by moment, hour by hour on that first day. The command to worship demanded their time, and it also demanded their money, as we see. You know, in their case, it boiled down to a simple matter of maximizing profits, and resting and worshiping was just bad for business. Notice several consequences to this that we see in our passage. And the first one is in verse 10. Nehemiah says, I found that the portions of the Levites had not been given to them, so that the Levites and the singers who did the work had fled each to his field. The worship of God had suffered dramatically while this day was forsaken. And verse 11 is explicit. Notice, why is the house of God forsaken? You know, it's reasonable to infer that they weren't just breaking the Sabbath during the harvest. No, they were breaking it before, during, and after the harvest. That this had taken place over some period of time. The Levitical priests could offer no sacrifice for sin because they weren't supported. No one brought an offering. The church of their day was not funded, so there was no worship. You know, those who led the singing had to flee for the same reasons. They had to support themselves as they returned to their fields. It reminds me of an old saying. A pastor once said, it takes 3 books to run a church. It takes a holy book, it takes a hymn book, and it takes a checkbook. You see the effects. When the ministers and worship leaders are not supported, they go home. You know, this was an indirect result of not honoring this day. And we know this because Nehemiah put a stop to it in verse 11. You know, after he asks, why was the house forsaken? He goes on and says, I gathered them together and I set them in their stations. He's talking about the Levites. When you think about it, ignoring the Lord's Day not only meant that people didn't show up to worship, it meant they didn't tithe either. You know, they didn't give anything. No money, no offering, no praise to the Lord. And so what we see here in the command to rest and worship is a great test of our faith. Not only does God claim our time on this day, he claims our money as well. And I think our faith is tested nowhere greater than in these 2 areas, our time and in our money. And God, through this day, asserts his control on our time and money. And he breaks our grip on our time and money. You know, they're interrelated, aren't they? We spend time the same place where we spend money. We spend money the same places where we spend time. Where our treasures are, there our hearts will be. And there are gifts that God gives us, time and money, and yet it's so easy to hoard them. If we don't have one day in 7 to stop this inertia. You know, if you have children, then you've noticed, I'm sure, that every gift you give them has a blessing and perhaps a curse to it, a positive and a negative effect. Well, I think the same is true in the gifts God gives to us. I've noticed, almost without exception, when we give a gift to one of our children, later in the day, it is very hard to wrest that grip from their possession when it's time for bed or when it's time for homework. There is something about it this day very similar to that. It is a built-in stop to our busy week to ensure that God remains the focus. And if you want a good mental picture, think of a speed bump. I was thinking back years and years ago, 30 years or so, the speed bumps really today are they're very different than they were when I started driving. I mean, they were little more than just lifts in the pavement back then. You didn't really have to slow down. But today, you might be buying a new windshield if you don't slow down. This day is very similar to that if you honor and respect it. Ignoring the command to rest and to worship, it here naturally led to not tithing and almost certainly to half-hearted giving where it existed. The prophet Malachi prophesied in the same general time period that Ezra and Nehemiah did, and he gives a similar perspective. He says of their offerings in chapter 1, "You bring what has been taken by violence, what is lame, sick, as your offering." Think about what he's saying here. Imagine you're a farmer and you have a flock. You notice that one of your sheep is wounded or sick. And obviously you're not going to eat this animal. You're going to have to take it at a loss. You're probably not going to breed it with another animal as well. But then suddenly you get this great idea. I'll give it to the priest. What does he care? The problem, of course, is that in worship, we don't just give our offerings to a priest any more than you really don't give your money to a pastor or to any church employee. Yes, they're supported by it, but you give ultimately to God. And that's what they were doing, giving these inferior, lame animals. And Malachi goes on and says, "Cursed